السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وأهلا بكم في قناة ماروكان نيوز تيوب. فضلا وليس أمرا، لا تنسونا من اللايك والشير والسبسكرايب.
Macron's France has become a geopolitical irrelevance. Let nobody accuse Emmanuel Macron of lacking ambition. He appears to believe that he combines the strategic genius of a Napoleon, the diplomatic cunning of a Talleyrand, and the heroic stature of a General de Gaulle. In reality, however, Macron has made himself ridiculous on the international stage and reduced France to geopolitical irrelevance. If the French president had set out to cause chaos at home and abroad, he could hardly have done a better job. Having brought France to its knees by overriding strict protests and parliamentary opposition in order to impose pension reform by diktat, Macron has now alienated his allies with a disastrous state visit to China. His talks with Xi Jinping appear to have been a triumph for the Chinese, who flattered the Frenchman by treating him as the de facto leader of Europe. This put European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, whose visit coincided with Macron's and who represents the EU formally, in an awkward position. Macron and Xi discussed Taiwan intensely. French officials accompanying the president told the website Politico, which added that he appears to have taken a more conciliatory approach than the US or EU. The French president's exact position on the US's commitment to Taiwan and international access to the South China Sea remains to be seen, but it could be hostile. Macron seems to have naively taken at face value Xi's claim to be a peacemaker. Ignoring his guest's entreaties, the Chinese leader gave no assurances that he would put pressure on Putin over the war in Ukraine. No sooner had the French delegation left than Chinese forces began exercises simulating a naval blockade and precision strikes on Taiwan. Macron may justify his appeasement of Xi as a step towards strategic autonomy for Europe, but this is surely a nebulous concept that has already been discredited by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In an interview on the return flight, Macron set out his vision. He appeared to conflate European with French interests and irked the Biden administration by suggesting that Europe must avoid being drawn into a conflict over Taiwan. The paradox would be that, overcome by panic, we believe we are just America's followers, he said. Instead, he advocated a role for the EU as a third pole between Washington and Beijing. Is it in Europe's interest to accelerate a crisis on Taiwan? He asked. No. The worst thing would be to think that we Europeans must become followers on this topic and take our cue from the US agenda and a Chinese overreaction. If war were to break out between the US and China over Taiwan, Macron claimed, Europe will not have the time nor the means to finance our own strategic autonomy. In such a situation, he suggested, we will become vassals, whereas we could become the third pole. These remarks, en route from Beijing, among other comments made during his interview, were considered so provocative that the Élysée press office even tried to censor the English version. Politico, where the interview appeared, said that it had removed lines where Macron had spoken even more frankly about Taiwan and European autonomy. In Washington, where the line about Europe as a vassal of the US played into the debate about support for Ukraine, the reaction was predictably hostile. Many Americans, especially Republicans, want the European members of NATO to shoulder more of the burden for the defense of Ukraine. Marco Rubio, the Republican senator and former presidential candidate, said that if Macron had indeed spoken for Europe, then the US should focus on containing China and leave Europeans to deal with Russian aggression. Donald Trump made a cruder point. And in a speech on Tuesday in The Hague, Macron reinforced his demand for Europe to become a third superpower, though he was silent on Taiwan. This is not the first time that the French president has sown disunity in the Western alliance. A few years ago, he claimed that NATO was brain dead and suggested that it would eventually be replaced by an EU army. Yet his posturing was comprehensively debunked by the response to the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The US and the UK, not the EU, have provided the lion's share of military aid to Kyiv, while Finland has joined NATO, with Sweden soon to follow. Macron's overtures to Putin, meanwhile, have achieved precisely nothing. If the Russians ever do agree to serious negotiations, it will not be thanks to French diplomacy, but to Ukrainian victories on the battlefield. Even within the EU, divisions have been stoked between France and the countries of Central, Eastern and Northern Europe, which do not share Macron's romantic illusions about Russia. The United States remains the essential guarantor of European security. France, by contrast, has been exposed as a power in decline despite its nuclear weapons. Macron may like to present himself as Jupiter, the most intelligent figure on the world stage, with an erudition unparalleled by other leaders. He surrounds himself with intellectuals to whom he can display a historical grasp of foreign affairs, bordering on omniscience. But his silence on the threat to Taiwan indicates a worrying ignorance about economic reality. Consider, for instance, how along with China, Taiwan is one of the world's leading manufacturers of semiconductors, the building blocks of modern technology. The failure to deter Putin from invading Ukraine had dire consequences for European energy supplies and for developing countries that were dependent on grain imports. But a war between China and Taiwan of any duration could cause even greater disruption to the global economy, with airlines grounded, communications in chaos and entire computer systems ceasing to function. If US deterrence fails to halt Xi's threat to subjugate Taiwan, the economic impact could be more catastrophic than the COVID pandemic. And by undermining the united Western Front against Beijing, Macron risks making this scenario more likely. Charles de Gaulle began his memoirs with the celebrated words, "France cannot be France without grandeur." Emmanuel Macron may imagine that he is emulating de Gaulle's vision. In fact, he has merely been grandstanding.